Ma'am, I must ask, why is a civilian volunteer wearing military-issue identification tags? Is this some kind of fashion statement? The question, laced with the sharp, metallic tang of condescension, cut through the humid, chaotic air of the forward operating medical tent. The crowd of young, sweat-soaked Navy corpsmen and Army medics, already on edge from the relentless influx of casualties, fell silent. They laughed, but it was a nervous, brittle sound, the kind of laughter that seeks to curry favor with new authority and distance oneself from the target of its scorn. The target, a woman named Alara Vance, offered no reaction. She didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the polished shoes of Rear Admiral Fletcher that had stopped mere inches from the patient she was tending to. Her focus remained absolute, a universe contained within the few square feet of the gurney and the grievously wounded Marine lying upon it. Her hands, unadorned and scrubbed raw, moved with a fluid, mesmerizing economy. They were not the hesitant hands of a volunteer. They were the instruments of a master craftsman, each movement a testament to thousands of hours of practiced perfection. She was securing a pressure dressing to a deep shrapnel wound in the Marine's leg, her fingers applying precise, even tension, her knuckles white, but her touch impossibly steady. Fletcher, a man whose recent promotion had affixed a rigid spine of protocol to a core of deep-seated insecurity, felt a hot flush of anger. He was accustomed to immediate, unwavering deference. Silence in the face of his authority was not just insubordination. It was an insult. He saw a woman in plain, unmarked gray scrubs, her hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun, her face devoid of makeup and etched with a profound weariness that he mistook for apathy. He saw a civilian, an outsider, appropriating a sacred symbol of service. The thin, steel chain around her neck, disappearing into the collar of her scrubs, was an affront to the very order he was sent here to instill. He saw assumption, and his world was built on the bedrock of such assumptions. But from the far corner of the tent, observing the unfolding drama from behind a stack of medical crates, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne saw something else entirely. He saw the way she stood, not with the apologetic stoop of a subordinate, but with the grounded, centered posture of someone who had stood in the eye of far worse storms. He saw the specific, triple-looped field notch she used to secure the dressing, a technique not taught in any standard medical school, but favored by special operations medics for its refusal to slip under duress. And he saw the profound, almost unnerving calm that radiated from her, a pocket of absolute stillness in a symphony of chaos. A ghost of a memory, a story told in hushed tones 2 decades ago in a smoke-filled briefing room in a forgotten war, began to stir in the old Admiral's mind. He watched as Fletcher, his patience exhausted, puffed out his chest to escalate his public shaming. The new Admiral was about to make a mistake of monumental proportions, and Thorne knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he had to let it happen. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven by action, type competence below. Rear Admiral Fletcher cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly hushed tent. The whir of generators and the distant thrum of helicopter blades seemed to recede, focusing the world on his impending pronouncement. "Let me be unequivocally clear, for the benefit of everyone present," he began, his voice taking on the patronizing cadence of a lecturer addressing a class of slow-witted children. "The uniform, and every element thereof, is sacred. The dog tags worn by our service members are not trinkets. They are not accessories. They represent a solemn contract, a commitment to service, and in the gravest of circumstances, they are the last identifier of a fallen warrior. They are earned through sweat, through sacrifice, through a sworn oath to this nation." He paused, letting his words hang in the thick, humid air, his gaze sweeping over the assembled medics, ensuring his lesson was being absorbed. His eyes then settled back on Alara, his voice hardening into a blade of pure derision. For a civilian, a volunteer no less, to wear them in this environment is a gross violation of that sanctity. It is at best a display of profound ignorance, and at worst, a disgusting form of stolen valor. It implies a history that is not yours, a sacrifice you have not made. It is an insult to every single person in this theater of operations who has earned the right to wear that medal around their neck. He gestured vaguely at the wounded Marine on the gurney, a prop in his theatrical condemnation. It is an insult to him. The corpsmen and medics shifted uncomfortably. They knew the Admiral was technically correct about the regulations, but the sheer venom in his delivery felt disproportionate, cruel. They glanced at Alara, expecting a reaction, tears, a stammered apology, a defiant retort. They received nothing. She continued her work, her movements seamless. She finished with the dressing, picked up a hemostat to clamp a bleeder, and then checked the patient's pulse at the carotid artery, her 2 fingers resting gently on his neck. Only when she was satisfied with his immediate stability did she finally, slowly, lift her head. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold the memory of 1,000 sleepless nights, met Fletcher's. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was just a vast, empty calm. "It is not a fashion statement, sir," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the tent with more weight than Fletcher's booming lecture. The simplicity of her response, its utter lack of emotion or defense, seemed to unhinge him. It was a language of calm he could not comprehend. His face reddened further. "Is that all you have to say for yourself? Do you have any idea how this looks? It undermines the very discipline I'm trying to maintain here." From his vantage point, Fleet Admiral Thorne watched the exchange, his mind racing. The knot, the stance, the impossible calm, and now the voice. It was quiet, but it was not the voice of a subordinate. It was the voice of someone whose authority was not derived from a rank on their collar, but from something far deeper, something innate and immutable. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture he had long consigned to the archives of military myth. He knew he had to intervene, but not yet. The lesson had to be completed. The demonstration had not yet begun. The demonstration began with a piercing shriek of feedback from the communications tent, followed by a voice crackling with static and panic. "Moscow inbound. Irapat, Moscow." Sky Stallion had a hard landing on the perimeter, multiple critical injuries. ETA 60 seconds. The words acted as a lightning strike, shattering the fragile tableau of Fletcher's lecture. The tent exploded into a frenzy of controlled chaos. Medics scrambled for supplies. Doctors shouted for triage stations to be cleared, and the low hum of anxiety instantly crescendoed into a roar of urgent purpose. Rear Admiral Fletcher, for all his bluster about protocol and appearance, was momentarily paralyzed. This was not a problem that could be solved with a regulation manual. He began barking orders, but they were the orders of a manager, not a leader in the crucible of crisis. "Someone give me a casualty count. I want a manifest of all incoming wounded. Secure a landing zone for secondary evac." He was trying to impose order on a situation that required instinct, action, and a deep, visceral understanding of battlefield medicine. He was adding to the noise, a conductor waving his baton wildly after the orchestra had already abandoned the sheet music and was playing a raw, desperate symphony of survival. Alara Vance, however, moved as if the panicked announcement were a starting pistol she had been waiting for her entire life. She didn't run. She flowed through the chaos, a river of purpose in a sea of frantic activity. Her eyes scanned the prep stations not with panic, but with the rapid, calculating assessment of a grandmaster surveying a chessboard. She didn't grab a standard trauma kit. Instead, she assembled her own with a series of swift, precise movements. A 14-gauge needle for chest decompressions. A specific type of hemostatic agent, one rarely used in standard field hospitals, but known for its effectiveness in catastrophic hemorrhages. An emergency cricothyrotomy kit. Her hands moved with a blur of efficiency, gathering the tools she needed, her mind clearly 10 steps ahead of the unfolding disaster. She didn't shout orders. She directed the younger medics around her with quiet, simple gestures. A nod toward the plasma coolers. A pointed finger at the chest tube trays. A quiet but firm, "I need 2 units of oneg now," to a young corpsman who was frozen in indecision. They responded instantly, her aura of absolute competence cutting through their fear and providing a focal point in the storm. She was no longer just a nurse. She was the gravitational center of the entire emergency response, and she hadn't raised her voice once. The first wave of casualties arrived on field stretchers, a wave of broken bodies and agonized cries. Fletcher was still trying to organize a receiving line, a bureaucratic process colliding with the brutal reality of the moment. Alara ignored it all, her gaze fixed on the single most critical patient being rushed in. A flight crew chief, his flight suit soaked in blood, a jagged piece of metal protruding from his chest, his breathing a shallow, gurgling gasp. The monitor they hooked him to screamed a flatline alarm. A young doctor, barely out of residency, shouted, "He's crashing. No pulse. Started compressions." The young doctor was wrong. Compressions would do nothing but drive the metal deeper and exacerbate the internal bleeding. It was a fatal mistake born of panic and adherence to a textbook algorithm that didn't apply to the horrific reality of the injury. "Stop!" Alara's voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of absolute authority that cut through the electronic shriek of the flatlining monitor and the doctor's panicked shouts. Every head in the immediate vicinity snapped towards her. She was already at the patient's side, her hands gloved, her eyes locked on the wound with an intensity that was almost frightening. "He's not in cardiac arrest. He's in obstructive shock from a tension pneumothorax, and he's bleeding out. Compressions will kill him." Her diagnosis was delivered in a flat, clinical monotone, a statement of irrefutable fact. Rear Admiral Fletcher, who had come over to oversee the highest priority casualty, opened his mouth to object, to question who this civilian thought she was to countermand a commissioned medical officer. But the words died in his throat. He was utterly silenced by the sheer, undeniable certainty radiating from her. In that moment, her gray scrub seemed more commanding than his own starched, decorated uniform. Without waiting for permission, Alara took control. "I need that 14 gauge, she said to a wide-eyed medic, who slapped it into her waiting palm without hesitation. She located the second intercostal space on the midclavicular line with 2 fingers, a landmark she found by feel in less than a second. With a smooth, practiced motion, she plunged the needle into the pilot's chest. There was a sudden, audible hiss of escaping air, like a punctured tire. The pilot's chest, which had been unnaturally distended on one side, visibly relaxed. On the monitor, a weak, thready heartbeat flickered back to life. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. They had just witnessed a life being saved in the space of 3 seconds. But she wasn't done. That bought him a minute. He's still bleeding out from the subclavian artery. "Get the surgeon," she commanded. The young doctor stammered ease. "He's in surgery with the chopper pilot, ma'am. He's pinned down." Alara just nodded, as if she expected it. "Then give me a Foley catheter and a Kelly clamp." Now, it was a bizarre, nonsensical request. A Foley catheter was for draining a bladder. The medic stared at her, confused. "Now," she repeated, and this time there was a hard, steel edge to her voice. The items were produced. In a move of stunning ingenuity that no one there had ever seen or read about, she threaded the catheter deep into the chest wound, alongside the piece of metal. "Inflate the balloon," she ordered. The medic squeezed the syringe, inflating the small balloon at the catheter's tip inside the pilot's chest cavity. Alara then gently pulled back on the catheter until she felt resistance. The inflated balloon, now acting as an internal plug, pressed against the shredded artery, staunching the torrential bleeding. She secured it with the Kelly clamp. The effect on the monitor was instantaneous and miraculous. The pilot's blood pressure, which had been non-existent, began to register. The frantic beeping of the heart rate slowed, steadied, and found a life-sustaining rhythm. A zone of profound, deafening silence fell around the gurney. The chaos of the tent raged on around them, but in their small circle, there was only the steady beep of the monitor and the shared, stunned intake of breath. The young doctor looked from the monitor to Alara, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. Fletcher stood frozen, his mouth agape, his entire worldview, built on the neat and tidy lines of rank and regulation, shattered into a million pieces. He could only manage a choked, disbelieving whisper. That's not possible. How did you know how to do that? Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne chose that exact moment to move. He walked through the sea of bodies and equipment, his steps measured and deliberate, his presence parting the chaos like a ship's bow through water. The medics and doctors instinctively made way for him, their awe at what they had just witnessed, now mixing with trepidation at the arrival of the theater's supreme commander. Thorne's gaze, however, was not on the miraculously stabilized patient, nor did it spare a single glance for the shell-shocked Rear Admiral Fletcher. His eyes were fixed solely on Alara Vance. He came to stop beside the gurney, the scent of antiseptic and blood thick in the air between them. He looked at her hands, now methodically cleaning the instrument she had used, her movements just as precise and calm as they had been before the crisis. He looked at her face, which remained an unreadable mask of professional focus. There was no hint of triumph, no flicker of pride. There was only the quiet completion of a necessary task. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his decades-old memory was not a phantom. "Ms. Vance," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble of gravel and command, yet it carried an immense weight that demanded and received the absolute attention of everyone within earshot. It was not a summons. It was a request, imbued with a deep and startling current of respect. "May I see your tags?" The question hung in the air, electric. Fletcher's face, already pale with shock, lost another shade of color. He had publicly crucified this woman over those very tags, and now the Fleet Admiral was asking to see them with a tone one might use to address a visiting dignitary. Without a word, without breaking her calm, Alara reached under the collar of her scrubs. The movement was slow, deliberate. She drew out the thin, silver chain. The two pieces of metal resting on it were dull, not from neglect, but from age and wear. Their edges were smoothed over, their surfaces scratched and pitted from a life of hard use. They were not the crisp, new tags of a recent recruit. They were artifacts. She held them out in her open palm. Thorne did not simply take them. He leaned in, his expression one of profound solemnity, as if he were examining a holy relic. He gently took the tags between his thumb and forefinger, his touch surprisingly delicate. The silence in the tent was now absolute. Even the distant helicopters seemed to have ceased their clamor. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor from the patient she had just saved, a life-sustaining metronome counting out the seconds of this monumental reveal. Thorne angled the tags to catch the harsh glare of the overhead surgical lamp. His old eyes traced the faded, stamped letters. Thorne read the first tag, his lips moving silently. It was standard as expected. Vance Alara, blood type, religious preference. Then he moved to the second tag. This was the one that mattered. This was the key that would unlock the entire mystery. He squinted, his focus absolute. He didn't read it aloud at first. He just stood there for a long, pregnant moment, the weight of history pressing down on him. The assembled staff leaned in, their collective breath held. Fletcher, drawn by an invisible force, took a half-step closer, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. Finally, Thorne looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces watching him before it landed, with the force of a physical blow on Rear Admiral Fletcher. Then, in a voice that was both a proclamation and a eulogy, he read the inscription aloud. Tag 1, Vance Alara. O negative. In no religious preference, he paused, letting the mundane details create a stark contrast for what was to come. Tag 2. He held it up for Fletcher to see, though the letters were too worn to be legible from more than a foot away. It does not bear a service number. Instead, it is stamped with a unit designation, dust off 7 to 3. Below that, a motto, in extremis ad salutem, and below that, a single etch-call sign, Ghost, a few of the older, grizzled senior NCOs on the periphery of the crowd stiffened. A flicker of dawning, horrified recognition passed through their eyes. Dust off. It was an old call sign, a name from a forgotten era of warfare. But Fletcher, a product of the modern, streamlined Navy, looked utterly baffled. The names meant nothing to him. Thorne's expression hardened, his patience with the junior admiral's ignorance clearly exhausted. "Rear Admiral Fletcher," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Are you familiar with Joint Special Operations Task Force 7-3? Fletcher stammered, "Sir, I believe it was a unit active during the Halcyon conflict, but the records are heavily classified." "They're not classified, Admiral." Thorne cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. "They were erased. Officially, Dustoff 7-3 never existed. They were a clandestine pararescue unit, a team of medics and surgeons considered so unorthodox, so high risk, that their very existence was a liability. They weren't soldiers. They were specialists dropped behind enemy lines, often alone, with minimal support, to retrieve and save high-value assets that no conventional unit could reach. They operated in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In extremis, Thorne let the words sink in, the Latin motto now imbued with a terrifying, literal meaning. They didn't have ranks in that unit, Admiral. Ranks were a luxury they couldn't afford. They had only reputations, built on blood and skill. And the medic known as Ghost, Thorne's voice softened, a deep, profound reverence creeping into his tone. Ghost was a legend, even among them. The one they sent in when all hope was lost. The one who could perform surgical miracles in a ditch under enemy fire with nothing but a knife and sheer force of will. "We thought she was killed in action during the siege of Al-Qadra. Her name is on a black granite wall in a building you don't have clearance to enter." He turned his gaze back to Alara, who had remained silent and still through the entire revelation. He gently placed the tags back into her waiting hand. Then, in a single, fluid motion that sent a shock wave of disbelief through every person present, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a 4-star officer and the decorated commander of the entire Joint Task Force, snapped his body to the rigid, formal posture of attention. He raised his hand to his brow and delivered a slow, perfect, heart-stoppingly precise salute to the unassuming civilian nurse in the plain gray scrubs. The sight of the Fleet Admiral saluting a civilian volunteer was so fundamentally jarring, so contrary to the rigid caste system of the military, that for a moment, nobody knew how to react. It was as if the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended. The salutes of enlisted personnel to officers were a matter of routine. The salutes between officers were a sign of mutual respect. But a 4-star admiral saluting a civilian was an event of an entirely different magnitude. It was an act of profound, almost sacred veneration. It was a public and absolute declaration that the woman standing before them possessed a stature that transcended rank, protocol, and uniform. Her quiet, demonstrated competence had just been validated in the most powerful way imaginable. The silence that followed the salute was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the thunderous noise of shattered assumptions. Every medic, corpsman, doctor, and officer in that tent was reevaluating everything they thought they knew. They looked at Alara Vance, the volunteer, and saw her for the first time. They saw the weariness in her eyes not as apathy, but as the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of someone who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had chosen to face it time and time again. They saw the practiced economy of her movements not as detachment, but as the hyper-efficiency of a professional who knew that wasted seconds cost lives. Her silence was no longer enigmatic. It was the solemn quiet of someone for whom words were inadequate to describe the things she had done and seen. The story, as stories of such mythic proportions do, escaped the confines of the medical tent almost instantly. It didn't spread like wildfire. It spread like a shockwave. A young corpsman who witnessed it all described the scene in a hushed, breathless call to his friend on the flight line. A senior chief petty officer, one of the few who recognized the name Dustoff, pulled aside a group of junior sailors in the mess hall and told them a story about the ghosts who used to save downed pilots from impossible situations. The tale of the quiet nurse, the arrogant admiral, and the fleet admiral's salute became the currency of the entire base. It was traded in whispers in maintenance bays, debated over lukewarm coffee in briefing rooms, and recounted with growing embellishment in the barracks late at night. The legend of Ghost was reborn. For Rear Admiral Fletcher, the experience was nothing short of a public execution of his ego. He stood there, frozen, long after Thorne had lowered his salute and walked away. The weight of 100 pairs of eyes was on him, but they were no longer looking at him with the deference his rank commanded. They were looking at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was a cautionary tale. Later that day, after the last of the casualties from the helicopter crash had been stabilized and evacuated, Fletcher found Alara restocking a supply cabinet at the back of the now-quiet tent. He approached her slowly, his polished shoes scuffing awkwardly on the temporary flooring. He looked smaller, diminished, his uniform seeming to hang loosely on his frame. The arrogance had been stripped from him, leaving behind a raw, humbled man. He stood before her for a long moment, struggling to find the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, why I said earlier. I had no right. I was wrong. I apologize. It was not a grand speech, but its sincerity was absolute." He had built his world on the foundation of his own correctness, and that foundation had been pulverized. Alara Vance turned from the sterile packets of gauze she was counting, her expression as placid as ever. She looked at the humbled Admiral, a man who hours before had sought to humiliate her in front of his entire command. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the painful shattering of his pride. There was no flicker of satisfaction in her gaze, no hint of, "I told you so." Vengeance and vindication were luxuries for those who had the time and energy to spare for them. She had neither. Her entire being was oriented toward a single, unwavering purpose, the mission. Her response, when it came, was as concise and professional as every other action she had taken. She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. "Focus on the patients, Admiral," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That's all that matters here." With that, she turned back to the supply cabinet, the crisp rustle of a sterile wrapper signaling the end of the conversation. The absolution was not in her words, but in her immediate return to the task at hand. She was demonstrating, yet again, that personal slights and matters of ego were irrelevant noise. The work was the only thing that was real. The gesture was not lost on Fletcher. It was, in its own way, a far more profound lesson than Thorne's salute had been. The salute had corrected his ignorance. Alara's simple, focused dismissal of his apology corrected his entire perspective. He had been obsessed with appearances, with respect, with the trappings of authority. She was concerned only with outcomes, with life, with the quiet, thankless, and essential duty of care. He walked away from that encounter a changed man, the rigid framework of his worldview replaced by the dawning understanding of a deeper kind of service. In the days that followed, the legend of the Ghost solidified into institutional lore. One of the young medics who had been guided by her steady hands during the mass casualty event had, in the chaos, snapped a quick, candid photo on his personal datapad. It wasn't a perfect shot. It was grainy, slightly out of focus, and poorly lit. It captured nothing of the high drama, only a close-up of Alara's gloved hands as she calmly and methodically cleaned a Kelly clamp, her focus absolute. Yet, the image was incredibly powerful. It was a picture of pure, unadorned competence. The medic printed it out on a flimsy piece of paper and, with a newfound boldness, pinned it to the main briefing board in the medical tent, right next to the official command notices and personnel rosters. He didn't write her name. He didn't need to. Beneath the image, he simply took a black marker and wrote a single word. Ghost. The photograph and its stark caption became a touchstone for the entire medical unit. It was a silent, constant reminder. It told them to look past the uniform, to value skill over status, and to understand that the most important work was often done by the quietest person in the room. It became a symbol of their highest aspiration, to be that steady, competent hand in the midst of chaos. Weeks turned into a month, and the multinational disaster relief operation began to wind down. The temporary structures were dismantled, the hum of constant activity subsided, and the first waves of personnel began to rotate home. The field hospital, once a bustling epicenter of life-and-death struggle, was now a collection of packed crates and empty tent frames. The immediate crisis had passed, but the atmosphere among the medical staff had been fundamentally and permanently altered. A new group of medics, fresh-faced and eager, arrived to assist with the final stages of the drawdown. As they were being given their orientation tour, a seasoned master sergeant, a man with leathery skin and eyes that had seen 3 decades of service, stopped them in front of the main briefing board. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the grainy, black-and-white photo that remained pinned there, now faded by the relentless sun. "Listen up," he said, his voice a low growl that commanded their immediate attention. "You're going to see a lot of rank in your career. You're going to see a lot of shiny medals and fancy uniforms. Most of it doesn't mean a damn thing. I want you to look at this picture." The new medics stared at the image of the anonymous, focused hands. "A few weeks ago," the sergeant continued, "the woman those hands belonged to saved a dozen lives in 10 minutes, right here where you're standing. She did it after a brand new Admiral tried to publicly humiliate her because he thought she was just some clueless volunteer. He saw her clothes, not her competence. He heard her silence, not her skill. He made an assumption, and it almost cost him his career and a pilot his life." The sergeant tapped the photo. That woman was a legend, a ghost. She never raised her voice, never asked for a thing, and never sought a shred of credit. She just did the work. That is the standard. Look for competence, not credentials. Listen for the quiet ones. Respect is earned in the silence between heartbeats, not in the noise of a command. Remember the ghost. Alera's actions had become a parable, a piece of institutional folklore passed down to the next generation not as a story of individual heroism, but as a core lesson in professional ethos. Her legacy was not a medal or a citation. It was a cultural shift, a change in the way soldiers and medics were taught to see the world. As for Rear Admiral Fletcher, his transformation was complete. The final glimpse anyone had of him was not on the command deck or in a high-level briefing, but in the long-term recovery ward back at the main naval hospital. He wasn't there for an inspection. He was there as a volunteer, in civilian clothes, sitting quietly by the bedside of the very flight crew chief whose life Alera had saved. He wasn't talking. He was listening, his posture open and humble, his face filled with a quiet empathy that had been absent just a few weeks before. He had learned the most important lesson of leadership, that true authority comes not from the rank on your shoulders, but from the service in your heart. Alera Vance herself disappeared as quietly as she had appeared. One day, she was there, her presence a silent, calming anchor in the medical tent. The next, she was gone. There was no farewell ceremony, no letter of commendation read aloud at morning formation. Her departure was as unassuming as her arrival. She left behind no official record of her time there, only a locker cleared of its few personal effects and a legacy that was already becoming larger than life. Her story became a permanent fixture in the unofficial history of the operation, a modern myth whispered from one generation of service members to the next. It served as a powerful reminder that the most significant contributions often come from the shadows, from the quiet professionals who move through the world without fanfare, their only testament the excellence of their work and the lives they touch. True strength, the story taught, is not found in the volume of a voice or the shine of a medal on a chest. It is not contained in a title or a rank. It is found in the steady hand that works in the darkness when no one is watching. It is found in the profound calm that settles over a soul forged in the crucible of unimaginable pressure. It is the silent, unwavering competence that needs no introduction and seeks no applause. The ghosts in the system, the quiet professionals like Alera Vance, do not work for recognition. They work because the work itself is necessary. Their competence is their creed, their actions are their only sermon, and the lives they save are their only legacy. They don't seek the spotlight because their purpose is to be the light in the moments of deepest darkness, a steady flame that guides others through the storm. They remind us that assumptions are the enemy of truth, that arrogance is the brittle shell of insecurity, and that true worth, the kind that endures and inspires, is always proven, never proclaimed. The world is built and saved not by the loudest voices in the room, but by the quiet, methodical competence of its unsung heroes, its ghosts, whose silent dedication forms the very bedrock of civilization. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent action defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.